Happy Friday, everybody. We're live again here on Friday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Mountain. Here with you for Bioactive Live Q&A, where we really like to connect with everybody in the community and get your questions on topics that we're coming up with. If there's topics that you guys want to hear about, shoot us some DMs. We'd love to get some feedback on that. But this week we're going through some exotic springtails, as I like to call them. Others might call them tropical springtails. Some people call them designer springtails. It's kind of a newish niche in the bioactive world, which I think is really cool. And it's something that I started working with over the past year and a half, with kind of some motivation from Brian. It all started with rearing white springtails, which is just kind of what they refer to as Fulsomia candida, or just like a standard Collembola. But just to be clear, all the springtails that we're talking about today are going to be coming from the Collembola family. So that's really going to be your basis for all the springtail collections are going to be coming out of that Collembola. They all have some sort of relativity, or they're related in some way, I should say. Um, but they're all different and super unique. As Kevin saw, he got his package yesterday, and I sent him the kind of the gambit of what we carry. So yeah, started as a white springtail thing, kind of from a commercial aspect, where Brian, going to these shows and having the volume that he's got on his website, he needs to have a good stock of white springtails at a high level. So I spent a good year just figuring that species out, and really refining that into a product that was sellable. It probably took 5 months after we first talked about it, Brian, to when it came to inception. And that's one of the nuances of doing bioactive kind of hobbies, is that they take time, just like natural farming takes time. um, these hobbies, these rearing procedures, they do take time, they take patience, and it's a trial and error process. So um, we're not just going to talk about rearing today. We can definitely get into that on a later episode. But if you guys have questions on specific species, rearing them, throw them in the comments. We'll get to it. If we usually always have time for every question. So anyways, the whites are kind of where it all began. And then probably it was about a year ago when I started working on rearing these other species. And the species that I'm talking about, if you look at our website, and maybe Brian can bring up some pictures on a different slide here. But we carry basically a rainbow collection of springtails. We carry everything from a tire red, like a vibrant, beautiful red, through an orange, two different species of oranges, yellow springtails, blue springtails, purple hued springtails, and then several different arid species that are going to be more fast moving, thrive in a drier environment, like a hognose snake environment, or the dry side of your bioactive, because usually you're going to have a moisture gradient. So it's nice to have, in like the dry desert side, like Brian was talking about, where you have your heated side last week for that bearded dragon. Like, you can have a cleanup crew hanging out in that section. You can have a cleanup crew hanging out in the soil section. So um, that's where these different springtails kind of have different utilities. So these are going to be the reds. Um, and I guess I'll start with I'm just going to go through an explanation. Then Kev has a bunch of questions, and I want to kind of open it up. But just to give you kind of a synopsis, so you're going to have your tropical springtails, which are going to generally be like those more vibrant, the oranges, your reds. Those are the two main like tropical springtails that we carry. And those two are going to thrive in a slightly warmer environment than what I would call a temperate springtail. And a temperate springtail, just to go through those, is going to be basically everything else we carry except for the arids. So the whites, the yellows, the purples, the blues, those different species are going to thrive in a kind of a cooler environment. So understanding that right off the bat, um, So your tropicals, those oranges that Brian are showing, those are going to do well in like 80 degrees ish, 75. If you go lower, they slow down in reproduction. If you really want to go hard in the paint, you want it to be 75 to 80. And those tropical species have a higher protein diet, so they're gonna like stuff like we actually make two different types of food now. One's for a temperate springtail, one's for a tropical springtail. And just to read through the ingredients, it's similar to what I think has, or what Brian feeds his isopods for gut loading. Same concept with springtails. You can gut load these. So freeze dried Daphnia, lion's mane powder, reishi mushroom powder, spirulina powder, and nutritional yeast. So some protein based, some sea based stuff. I'm not exactly sure what. I think spirulina is freeze dried fish carcass. It's a type of fish. Is that right, or is Daphne a fish? No, Daphne is fish. Spirulina is like an algae. I'm sorry, I mixed those two up. More protein, right? So if you think about in a bioactive protein, that's going to be like your fecal matter. They're going to do some of the heavy lifting on that kind of stuff. If you think about in a living soil container, think about like your crab meals. They're going to do work on those hard things that generally take a long time to break down. And then when you switch over from that tropical, so like I said, tropical is going to generally be like a heavier protein diet. On the temperate side of things, what really works for us with like what I use to breed whites on a commercial level, what I use to breed basically everything else on a commercial level, it's either going to be with this food, the tropical, or with the temperate. And the temperate has a little bit of a different run through, and it's going to sound familiar, but it's barley, organic barley, corn, lentil, oat, wheat bran, and brewer's yeast. So it's basically just our Benny Boost, but completely pulverized into a powder, and then we add some yeast to it. And that tends to not rot in the container. And I guess like that's getting deeper into the rearing stuff, but that's just a run through of a kind of what we carry. And then going into the arids like a mixed diet of both of these things, and it's very light, but they generally are just going to be eating woody bits and materials. So they have kind of a more exact, like they have more of like a jungle gym cage or culture where they're going to have more sticks and woody stuff, wood chips. Um, Whereas like you'll see in some of those pictures, like in that orange picture right there, Brian, um, that is clay substrate. That's going to be a calcium clay. It's a special type of clay. They use it for making uh, this type of clay. They call it Euro clay, but it's used in making tennis courts. But it's like an organic clay, just very, very fine powder. It works really well for culturing. It also contains calcium. So when you talk about gut loading, and when you feed these things, you want to keep your culture on the dry, like you don't want it to be dry, but you want it to not be sopping wet because you want the springtails to eat the clay. When they eat the clay, now all of a sudden that's a great calcium source for something like a dart frog, um, or like a smaller insectivore to munch on. Um, and then Brian, if you go back up to the reds, actually I don't know if it's in the picture or not, but if you go into the red, and you'll see that container there. Yeah, that soil substrate picture. So the substrate we use is it's a mixture of flake soil, rotten wood, ideally like a white wood that's kind of slightly rotten, good compost, and then some moss, like some peat, like not regular moss, but kind of like mood moss, that green kind of stringy stuff gets mixed in there with some charcoal bits. It's a kind of a diverse mixture that's a little different than anything you see, just because it's very airy. Lots of little nooks and crannies for them to reproduce in. And then there's like a secondary food source. So they'll feed on that soil when you're not able to feed that container, which is really nice. It's like a slow release, but we don't currently sell it. I'm working on sourcing and making all those ingredients that go into it. Um, but that's what I use for mine, and I make sure, because of that, you think of compost, it's going to be alive and stuff. It's really important when you're rearing, especially on a commercial level. It's counterintuitive to living soil bioactive, because you want a diverse collection. Here you want a sterile substrate. So you're going to want to make sure you store these substrates when they're not being used on frozen is ideal. And freezing these things for extended periods of time is a great way to sterilize, to make sure that you're not starting a culture that's a mix of different things. Because I know that if you're rearing springtails, you want to, ideally, if you have like a culture of those springtails, you want them to be those springtails. Yeah, and then that's kind of the synopsis. I guess that would be kind of like your overview of springtails. Oh, okay. So then the other thing to consider with springtails in your cleanup crew is where they're going to be cleaning up, right? So some of these species stay right on the surface. They don't really delve down deep. Like if you go to the pearlescence, um, they're more of like an arid species. Those giant silver bullets, they do burrow down, but like the pearlescent right there at the bottom left, Brian. So pearlescent springtails, they're more of a top feeder. So they'll be cleaning up on top, whereas your whites, your reds, your yellows, those will come up when there's food available, but when there's not food, or food is breaking down through the soil strata, they'll move down through. And then you have globular springtails, which we carry as well. Those stay low. So they're like picking up all the low stuff. So if you consider that process where, on top you have your heavy movers. The other thing to consider is size, right? So like a blue springtail is going to be really small. They reproduce very, very um, very fast. And so to have them in conjunction with like a red, they'll be doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the cracks where the reds aren't going to be, because reds are going to reproduce a lot slower. So they'll look really cool when they come out to feed on protein and stuff like that. But a lot of the time, those will be catching up in populations where the blues will just go crazy. You don't necessarily see them because they're so small. Like that video on my website is way zoomed in. But you can get an idea of how ferocious they are at just moving, and you can see how small the small guys are there, the babies. But they come out fully grown, ready to eat. So even the small, tiny little ones are moving and eating. So yeah, so anyways, I thought that would be kind of like a good introduction to kind of kick it off. And there's like obviously ways that you can use them in different environments to steer your outcome. So like if you're looking for color and vibrancy in there, you can achieve that with these. If you're looking for effective cleanup crew, you can achieve that with these. If you're not so particular on what species you want to be seeing or not seeing, so it's a cool opportunity here to expand the microorganism like level of your bioactive, or even your living soil, where you can turn nutrients faster, improve that nutrient cycling process.
Kevin, I know you got some questions you want to fire away. You did though.
All right. I'm just actually right now looking at mibeneficials.com and seeing how much information you do put underneath the Springtails. I'm looking at the Thai red Springtails right now, but
That's
that
the
is
hottest thing on the market when it comes to Springtails, is those red ones.
so. What's first of all? I have just some. I'm just gonna. So everybody listening, I got my. If you saw on Instagram, I got a bunch of different Springtails, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, maybe something like that. A bunch of different kinds, and they're colorful. They're really cool. The yellows are yellow. The blues are very small, but they're blue. The reds are big. They look maybe like a small tick. Even they're huge compared to the blues. They're really big. But I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about Springtails. I'm learning just like everybody else on here. Mark is our guy for that. So I don't have to know everything. I just got to know Mark. It's that easy. But is there a name to the clay mixture that you make? Because on the big red one that came, it seemed like it said something, and then I thought it was kind of mentioned the mixture. Because I don't have it with me. I'm in Branson right now, but is there a name for it?
No, well, yeah, it's called if you look it up, it's calcium bearing clay. Or Euro clay is what the product actually is. It's basically refined, really fine clay, but contains calcium. So I can't remember what it is that's in the clay mixture that gives it that calcium, but that's what it is.
I see. I'm trying to look at it on a video I have on my phone. So there are the ones you sent me. I got the reds, the Florida oranges, the lilac, the yellow albino, the blues, the pearlescence, globular, cave, springtails. I think that's all of them. But those are those a variety of, as you called them, the arids and then the tropicals? Are Tell me about that first of
So
all.
so the pearlescence would be probably the only arid species that I would say that I sent you. We carry other arid species, like the Tomoceras vulgaris. I call it a quicksilver. It's just a fast moving silver land runner species of springtail. It looks quite different. It's got a super shiny exterior, uh, seemingly harder shell. Like it doesn't look like it has like a squishy body, right? It looks more like I don't want to say a roach, but it almost does. Like it would have the same body type of like a exoskeleton seemingly, but they're definitely not. They're fragile for sure. So then you have Tomoceras vulgaris. You've got the giant silver bullets are going to be pretty decent in an arid setup as well. The woolly mammoths, which I'm still working on the rearing. I had a very limited release of those. Those are also going to be a good arid option as well. So is my camera all screwed up? Sorry, I froze, guys.
Yeah, it's been frozen almost the whole time actually. But we can still hear your audio.
The
You're
entire
muted, Kevin,
the entire episode, Bry.
pretty much. And Kevin, you're muted, but
All right, ready for another question, Mark?
Yes, sir.
So some of these springtails, some came in that clay mixture that you're talking about, kind of red looking clay mixture, and there's a bunch of them all over it, just going crazy. They are all active and alive, man. When they showed up, they're still active and alive. Um, how? Oh yeah, and then like the reds, I remember they were in like an IMO3, if you will, just kind
Yep.
of a woody bit mixture. How do I apply those? Those are two different substrates they're on. How do I apply that? Do I apply the clay mixture? Do I apply some of that the IMO3 with the springtail? How do I add that?
Yeah, so I guess it would like if your goal is just to get them into the bioactive, right? Like if it was me, and the goal was to get it into the bioactive, I would just dump it right out, right? Like so the soil mixture, I would dump that right into the bioactive. The clay, I would tip it over and I'd tap it, but not from a height, obviously, just like right over top of the substrate in your container. And then if your goal is to rear them and you want a true isolated culture, the way that if I'm like bringing in a species from outside my repertoire, I'm bringing it in, I'm removing them one by one from whatever substrate they came on. To ensure that I'm not bringing any sort of contamination in. So I'll have my sterile. I ran through kind of the ingredients of like a soil substrate. So if you're rearing the reds or the oranges, a soil like and also like yellows will do fine in a soil substrate, and lilacs will as well, but I don't raise them on that because they do better in a clay substrate. They're also easier to harvest from a clay substrate. So it's really, I guess it depends on what your goal is. So if the goal is to start your own cultures, get your own substrate going, whether it's the calcium bearing clay, make sure you mix it, make sure that you're not storing it open air where things can just materialize. Because I'm telling you guys, like white springtails, common springtails will literally just materialize. And if you're sitting like different species of cultures next to one another, they will, like when you're opening them and you're not following like SOPs, like you'll contaminate your cultures. So it's really important to be careful of that. So right off the bat, I'm pulling them out one by one. Even if you bought it from me, I would still pull them out one by one. Um, just because who knows, right? Like I just would start my own clean culture. If I was going into a bioactive container, the goal is to have bustling life. So you want all the shit that's in that container, all of it, and then some, whatever else you can get. So, I would say just dump it right in there. Um, and then, if you're looking to, I guess those would be the two only things, right? You start in a container, or you're going to be kind of starting your own culture.
Yeah, but so what about the clay, the food itself? If
Yeah.
I'm turning that over and, let's say I give it just a little tap and, some fall in there, are you allowed to take some of that clay matter and put it into a terrarium?
Yeah. Yeah, you could. You could, because the reason I like clay, so like in my rearing containers, I'll have half a portion of clay and I'll have half a portion of soil substrate in certain species, like the reds and the oranges. And the reason I like clay is because you can really see them pop. So that makes it better for obviously collection, but population count, just for showing them off. So if you have a little chunk of clay in there, like even if you put that whole plop of clay in there, which I would recommend so you don't kill the springtails. I would do that after you've tipped it over and tap them all out of there. Because if you stick your finger in there, you're gonna bury springtails in that clay. You're gonna squish a bunch of them that you can't even see. I would just get like 99% of them out, and you get them all out by tapping the crap out of it. And then if you wanted to scoop a little blob of that and stick it into your bioactive, I'd use that as like a feeding point if you're ever going to add a little something extra for the isopods or springtails. And they'll generally eat a lot of the same stuff because I think we have overlap in what these things like to eat. Um, so so if you're using isopod food, I think that will crush for some of these species. If you're not, and you have defecation in your ecosystem, I think that's what's going to really help these species thrive, because they're heavy protein feeders, and I think that's where a lot of that protein's coming from.
Okay, so we're kind of gonna just go around that. So can a little brand new bearded dragon that's about 4 or 5 inches long, does it defecate enough to feed all of them? And let's say if it didn't, are there what would I add? Are there things that you just said protein? Um, there's all kinds of ways to get protein in there, but like maybe like a milled powdered substance, maybe is the idea. Go ahead.
Yeah, good question. So like I'm not trying to push my food. You can buy this food if you want, but what I would look at and what I always do is I look at the ingredients, right? Like Brian likes to say. I like to look at the ingredients and see what's in there. So you can get away with feeding, your temperates, your whites, your yellows, all those with just yeast, right? Like a lot of people just use yeast because yeast doesn't yeast by itself won't put off a heavy amount of CO2, right? So in a lot of my containers, most of my containers, except for a few specific species, they're all going to be airtight. So really important for me when I'm feeding these things that I'm putting in the appropriate amount of food, enough where they can eat it in about 2 to 3 days. And that amount, as I'm watching that container grow in populations, will slightly go up. It doesn't have to. When you get to a certain level and have been doing this for some time, you'll start to get in tune with your container. But for a beginner standpoint, I would stick to like a tiny little. Even these containers that we sell this in are dangerous because you see the hole size. They're big, right? So you got to be really careful with the amount that you put in. So back to the yeast, like if you just go with yeast, it's probably one of your safest options because it's not going to put off excess CO2 in a closed container, and it's not going to completely suffocate them. Springtails are a high CO2, low oxygen thriving species, so a lot of them are. So they thrive in that environment with a balance, right? So understanding start really really small, especially with a starter culture. Start with like a pinch, right? And then see how that goes in 3 4 days. I like to use clay because if I put it on the clay and I see it starting to mold, that means that it's starting to like ferment and it's starting to kick off excess CO2. I can literally just scrape it off the top, just take a little bit of the clay with it, but I can take some of that off and I can mitigate that culture from crashing out, right? And if once you get into this, the most disappointing thing when you've got a culture cranking, and I actually going back to what I said, don't listen to what I said. That's a terrible, terrible habit to get into, to start upping your feeding amount, because that's when you do run into issues. And I've even run into that issue before, where you'll lose an entire culture. So if you're doing this at a commercial pace, I would have multiple cultures. You know, give yourself the ability to quarantine your issues and play with stuff a little bit too.
And
So when you,
hold on, I just wanted to highlight what he said there because that is a gold bar. If you've never been into Springtails, everybody that gets into Springtails sees them and thinks it's easy to do. And I assure you it's not. That's why Mark and I had conversations about this. The way that he goes and dives into stuff like this, I guess the last 10 minutes of what he just said there, you're not going to find that on the internet outside of this channel. And it's very hard to culture high-end springtails because a lot of them do crash. And that happens in the isopod game as well. So just hats off to you, man. It's like you're giving the playbook, but you're actually letting them see like the actual drawing of the plays and everything instead of just saying it, And I just wanted to highlight that before Kevin took over again.
yeah, good point. So
So I didn't even necessarily answer. So like if I was looking for something just to feed the whites, it would go with yeast. Or like if you're feeding the part of your bioactive that doesn't is not necessarily as protein hungry, yeast is a good addition. And as far as like the reds and the oranges, if you want to supplement, I would go with like shrimp, like crushed up dried shrimp tails or something like that. They'll love that, just like the isopods. They're gonna love anything that you're feeding those isopods to gut load. Um, so sorry, Kev.
no, very good. So I have a couple questions about what you said. When you said if fungi or bacteria take over the before the culture crashes out, you will scrape some of that away. What culture did you mean? Were you referring to the springtail culture?
Yeah, because you're not gonna be. I'm only referring to an airtight, like because you're bioactive, your beardy environment is not airtight. It's going to be open air. So I'm not at all concerned about that. Whatever the hell's going on there is great. You know, the mold, whatever is whatever. Like that's it's going to have other facilities in place to take care of it. But springtails are very particular and when they eat the food. So you got, and also if the food is too moist, it can become it is a big issue. So feeding it in a dry spot of the clay, not overwatering your bioactive, making it too wet, because that's kind of a common misconception. Um, I
So
just have better success when they're actually eating the clay and not like skimming on top of the water.
yeah, because they're hydrophobic. I was watching some videos and trying to learn more about these things that they float on top of the water. They don't get down in it. So that water will push them up above a food source, I assume, is one reason you don't want it wet. But the other thing was it says that they will naturally eat the decomposing stuff, which would include bacterias, saprophobes, and all those things, right? So but you said you're referring to breeding the culture, basically like a sterilized as much as you can container, right?
Correct. Yeah, which is completely counter. That's the one thing that I do in my operation that is like homogenized. You know what I mean? Because my biodiversity packs, that's not the goal. I want it to be cranking with diversity. I want them to all be in harmony, humming. But with the springtails, it's different because, some people do want to start a culture. They or do want to start a specific isolated culture. Some people collect them with the intent of keeping them separated as well. So, um, that's why I do it from like a commercial standpoint. But in like if the goal is to have a bioactive, it's fine to have it's okay to have the mix. Like that's what I'm starting to play with is finding the mix that works the best. Because if you're just gonna have one in there and you just want to see one color, you're kind of missing the point. Like you want them all in there because they're all going to be hitting different spots and cleaning up so optimally. Like if you see the difference between having just a red culture and having a red with blue springtail culture, they consume food about twice as fast. So it's not a small margin. It's big. It's like if you're really running into issues with like waste material building up, think about some blues, man. They're not spoken about. You don't even really see them, but they're moving. And if you look close, you'll see them and have an appreciation. Um, so
Um, so that was kind of my next question. You can mix these all together. Is there no aggressive cannibalism between the two or anything?
nope. So these species will they don't. I mean, they'll compete with one another for certain food. But I truly believe in your bioactive. If you've got like Brian kind of explained last week, you've got regenerating cover crops, you've got constant waste source, you're supplementing things, you have isopods that are also defecating. You've got other organisms in there that are defecating and adding different things into the mix. The springtails fill the rest of those voids, so they're not going to eat each other. The worst that will happen is that they'll outcompete one another, and one population will fall off. But other than that, there's really no risk or harm in mixing these. They're not going to hurt each other at all.
Yeah, so if y'all are considering isolating and trying to breed a population, I can promise you, you probably want to start with one strain because they are so small. When you said like opening them up, that immediately contaminates everything around you. And I was just opening them up and looking at them like, oh, that's awesome. Boom, close and open the next one. I wouldn't have any plans on isolating anything, but they are some of them are super duper small. Like you're probably not going to see them unless they're in that blob all together, like just one on you, you're probably not going to see it because it's really, really small. So what stages do these well, they're actually not, well, according to this video, they're not considered insects anymore because the eating mechanism was within their exoskeleton or something like that and not on the outside. So it's considered something else. So
Arthropod or hexapod.
a hexapod, that's what it was. So are there stages that these things go through? Because I know that they do shed their skin, their outer shells. And is it do they always look the same, or do they change shape or anything like that?
So yeah, they're born basically as like a fully, they have all the parts of an adult, right? They're just tiny. Then they go through molts, where they will shed that exoskeleton and then grow bigger. It's really weird to see on a clay culture, when some of these go through those molting phases, because like you'll literally see what looks like, uh, man, it's a kind of a morbid reference, but like, like after Hiroshima, you could see like the bodies like on the pavement. Like you can see the exoskeleton of the springtail on the clay, perfect form. You're like, oh fuck, like they're dying, and but it's not. That's not what it is. It's just that there's a contrast because the exoskeleton's white on that deep red clay. So you'll see like all these like bodies and you're going, what is going on? But they're just they're molting. So they'll go through molts, and then some species take a couple months to get to full size. Some species, like, that's where you have these higher value or less available species like your woolly mammoths. They take 2 months plus to get from a tiny little baby to full size, whereas a white can do it in a few days. And longer than that, but they go through that reproduction cycle at a much higher rate, and they grow much faster to a smaller size. So, um, to answer your question, they're born the exact everything functioning the way that an adult does, just small.
Let's see. Do they eat that molted exoskeleton, or will they
I
chew on
don't
it? Is there
I don't
anything?
honestly know, to be honest. I would definitely think that it would add back to the whole bioactive enclosure, though, to be eaten by whatever microbiology is going on. It kind of just works its way down the chain.
Yeah,
What
just
what we've noticed in the isopod game is that the babies, the man K, usually eat the stuff that's kind of more discarded. So they'll eat more of the exoskeleton, the really small things. So the springtails, like the really tiny ones you probably can't even see yet, break all of that kind of stuff down because it does eventually disappear. And in my opinion, I'm also using the red wigglers, and I think they love that as well. There's like bacteria and stuff that starts to form on it.
There's no doubt about it that the worm juices do magical things for everybody else. Like, that worms are the backbone of the whole thing. So in any, like, you're light years more protected from like things like mold and excess CO2 in your bioactive enclosure than in a closed environment culture. It's kind of a different concept, a different world, and you have to keep it closed because it keeps everything from coming in. Um, so I also wanted to actually, sorry, Kev, you probably have more questions. I don't want
go ahead,
to.
talk. I'll ask. Go ahead, talk.
I just wanted to show like you're not necessarily restricted by size either. Keep in mind that like springtails, I found they reproduce kind of like worms. I don't know that it's scientifically documented, but they're spatially aware, to a point, um, because you have to consider how they reproduce. So your male puts down these little sacs that are basically like floating all over the place, and they're full of sperm, and they're hoping for a female to basically run into it, and it will fertilize the eggs and do all that happy stuff. So you have to consider that if you're in a big environment with a small amount, like you have a big container, like this is this is like I would call this a big springtail container, but like this is what I use right here.
Is that a culture, making a culture
That's
versus?
one of them. This is one with some aeration, so it's not going to be. This one has the 200, 220 micron aeration on the side to keep as much as I can out. But like this would be a big culture. Um, and so if you're starting with a small population in a big surface area, consider how they reproduce where like you want them to kind of be trapped in a little bit. You almost want them to like treat it almost like a plant if you're starting a new culture. I'd start somewhere like here. If they're jumping springtails, something to consider. If they're jumping springtails, go with a deeper dish, right? Because they'll jump right out the top of these things. The whites, they do jump. These are great because they ship well from a commercial standpoint and all that stuff. That's why we package them in these. But
I can see them jumping in those containers. In that
oh
big container you held up, I could
yeah,
see them jumping up and down, storm of them in there.
yeah. So like when you first start the culture, maybe consider starting something smaller. Like think of it as a little plant that needs to harden, get those roots going in the smaller pot before you up pot it into something. Like I use these. I like these because they're small space stackable. I can keep nice independent cultures, and then I'll go up to like something like this size. So just consider, like I said, that like if you keep them tight at first, keep them really close proximity if you can. Even keep them in here. You know, this is what we ship in. Keep it in one of these for a few weeks at first, and then move it up. Um, just make sure you give it air, and you'll see a big difference from making a jump from a tiny little thing to a huge one. It was frustrating trying to figure out what was going on with that. That right there is like, I know not everybody's trying to get into the springtail game, but that right there is a nugget for sure. Something that took me over a year to figure out.
How are you transferring from a large container to a small container that you ship?
That's the one thing I didn't bring over here, but I'll show you a bigger one.
It's that suction deal.
Yeah, it looks like an aspirator, right? Like if you've got kids, you know, you got that booger sucker. It's kind of like that. This one, I don't have a straw on me, but basically, I'll have a collection cup. Let's see. So I'll stick a collection cup down here. And then on this end right here, a straw sticks out. And when I pump that bulb, every time I pump it, it's just like a little suck in, right? Little suction in. So, like we were talking about earlier, it's tough to do that when you've got a bunch of soil substrate that you're sucking up through that as well. So that's why I like to have a half clay where I can entice them out and time my harvesting based on when I'm feeding them. So I'll wait to feed till like a day before I know I got to fill orders. And I only fill orders on Mondays and Tuesdays because I like to cool down the containers, but also because of that reason. And also, I'm trying to find mental, internal work life balance. Otherwise, I'm working every day and just like killing myself, and it works out the best for literally everything, but mentally too. So that's why I do it on Mondays and Tuesdays because I got to time those harvesting based off when I'm feeding. Um, so yeah, something to consider, and something that makes it easier, Kevin. For you, if you were trying to share it from your bioactive, I would throw that chunk of clay in there or have like a little rock or something that you feed on top of, right? If you're going to supplement feed, pull them off of that. That way you can isolate them. You're not like digging through your whole soil trying to pull out a few reds or whatever you're trying to get out of there. Um, you can also use like a flat knife, like a butter knife. Just be gentle with them, and they'll be fine.
Yeah, I can understand the best way is to basically turn it over and tap, tap, tap. Because if you try to scrape that mud, like you said, you just mud slid all about 1,000 of them up there because they're super itty bitty. Brian, I have a few more questions. Brian, do you have any questions? I've been asking all of them. You have anything you want to ask?
Well, yeah, okay. When it's coming to the arid ones, Mark, that's what more people are wanting to get into, and I know that more reptile people are going to watch this probably than cannabis people, especially when you're talking about the ones that are more arid than the tropical. And so, from that point of view, what do you think is best for a bioactive cleanup that is extremely arid? People will, or I should say, snake breeders and people that have high-end things like a water monitor and stuff like that, they're very apprehensive to adding anything because of there's like these negative mites. Some of them are called like grain mites, and so when they hear the word even predatory mite, it scares them. So I was hoping maybe we could talk through what would actually be a bioactive setup for something that is designed to live in more of a arid environment.
Yeah, so admittedly, that's probably like my weaker side, and something that I'm learning more and more about because it's much more technical to replicate that environment at a commercial rearing level. Like I feel like they would like certain species would thrive in an actual bioactive much better than trying to replicate it in like a closed culture system or like with limited ventilation. So um they're less is known about them, and they're not as widely available because they take longer to reproduce. um, they're also very hard to ship. That's the one of the biggest hindrances. And I've had the most issues shipping um, those species because they like to ship on like a moist paper towel so that you can you're they're going to be so elusive and so hidden in like a soil substrate, and they're not going to do well at all on a clay substrate. So trying to ship them in that environment is tough, and it's much tougher with the swing. So they need to go in bigger containers, was what we found. Um, but anyways, back to your question. What I would recommend with like what we carry, it would be Tomoceras vulgaris, which is really probably the best, most prolific reproducing arid species. They're more resilient a wider range. They can do fine with just a tiny little bit of water, and they won't crash out if conditions get a little bit moist. Um, so Tomoceras vulgaris would be probably the first one I would look at. And then if you're looking for like a bigger feeder species, like the giant silver bullets, they get really big. They like a drier environment as well, but they're going to be a lot slower at reproducing, but they're going to thrive. Like I said, I think that's a species that would do much better in an actual bioactive where they can hide, get under crevasses, get into things that you wouldn't necessarily have in a culture setting. Their diet is also kind of eluding me because the stuff that I feed them, they don't react like the other species do. Where I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is definitely like the right concoction. So I'm still trying to figure that one out. And then the other one that does really well in a drier environment is the pearlescence, the Lepidocertus. The pearlescence, they're going to be smaller than those quicksilvers. They're not as silver and flashy as them, but they're going to reproduce even faster than those. And they do a really solid job cleaning up basically a wide range from like our yeast and barley corn based diet all the way. I switched. That's one of those species I switched diets up because they'll eat a range of food. um, so like pearlescence widely available. Like I have those are very resilient, and the Tomoceras vulgaris is another one that's widely available. So I would look at those two species specifically for arid. And they're good looking species too. So to see those running around is it's definitely not shouldn't throw off a negative connotation.
And they eat defecation.
Yeah, they'll both eat protein. Um, Tomoceros vulgaris is like that's all I feed them is like a protein rich diet.
I'll take it next step, man. It's easier to breed the rustics.
Do you breed spider mites, Mark?
No, but anybody who's rearing good like top level grade biocontrols like Californicus, Phallusis, that's like their game. They rear spider mites. It's all numbers. Because if you've got 10 million spider mites, you've got 50 million Californicus. You know what I mean? So they do rear spider mites, and they're probably the only ones that monetize on rearing spider mites.
Man, my compost, I don't know. They look like, when I've looked something up, it's called a clover mite. That's what it was shown, and it's a red colored mite. I don't know how many legs it has on it, but there will be times in the summer, just like right now, they'll probably start coming on, but they will. It's like an infestation. They're everywhere. Just me walking and grabbing a lid with my compost, it'll be all over my arm. It's not like crazy, but I'll see one or two on my arms. Like, they're everywhere. I really don't know what they are. They come and they go. Like, they don't. I don't see them anywhere else, but just in that compost with all that probably high nitrogen and things like that. But I need to get a picture of it and see it.
Those are clover mites,
Clover
and
mites.
they can be a pest to plants, and people do use biocontrols to to control them. Sorry, that's a redundant statement, but yeah, they use like Californicus will work against them if they're causing damage to your plant. But I haven't really seen it. I usually ignore them, especially outdoors. Indoors is a different story, but that hasn't really been an issue.
Yeah, I never have a problem with them on an indoor plant, or even like I might see some in the soil, but there's nothing like they like the compost environment out there. They're more attracted to it. So I have another question then. Back to the bearded dragon, because this is kind of what we're dealing with. That environment, you're trying to keep it a little bit arid, maybe on one side, a little warmer. And then, like Brian was saying, Brian, you seem to say you had almost two different formats going on, like a drier side and then maybe a grassier side, something like that, where he defecates on one side and then maybe lives on the other side, it seemed like. But do bearded dragons eat these springtails? Will they consume them if I put them in there with him?
I don't.
Were you asking me or
No, that's a
sorry?
Brian question. That's a
Yeah,
Brian question.
Brian would.
So when they're little babies like Kevin just got, more than likely they might eat a few of them, but they're not really. The isopod game is where it's at, and that's kind of where my business has flourished, is because, like we mentioned last week, if you're feeding them crickets, like some people say, it's kind of effective. They're real skinny, they smell, and all these kind of things, and so the springtails usually, I think, will be eaten because they're actually eating the dead carcasses of the crickets and stuff and some of these different things. I want to bypass all that, and I think Kevin, you probably do as well. Your wife will probably thank you as well. Not even dealing with things that smell. So crickets and dubias, they're kind of out that window. The springtails also will break down any kind of molting or defecation at first. And so then the isopods come and kind of finish the job. And like we'd mentioned last week as well, when everything's working in a symbiotic relationship, Mother Nature's all about that. And so there's more exchanges going on and everything's getting healthier. When one person is taking deboing, as we called it when I was younger, when you're taking from someone, taking their chains and their shoes and their starter jackets and all that stuff, well, then there's friction. Nobody wants to work with each other anymore. And so Mother Nature cuts that off. So springtails are somewhat eaten, but at the same time, they serve such a function that it seems like for whatever reason, man, they work in a symbiotic relationship with most things at the macro level.
And bearded dragons are just on a bigger level, right? If you go to like a smaller insectivore, and the reason why it's being talked about as springtails are being talked about as a feeder, um, is because if you can start rearing them and culturing them, and that's another reason you would, if you're not trying to necessarily start a springtail business, but you have, let's say, a dart frog, and you're not trying to buy wingless fruit flies and have to go to like spend a fortune at the pet store, go to the shows and try to get them on the cheap and people don't show up and everything else. If you can rear these bigger springtails at a higher level, and I can promise you that I could feed any dart frog with the amount of big juicy red or orange springtails that I have, by having a culture, I really think that there is something to be said there, and there is gut loading as well. Like Brian was talking about last week, plumping those guys up solid full of calcium, which is what those frogs need, what they're really looking for in their nutrition. Then you start understanding why clay culture is being used in a lot of respects. You start to understand um, why some of these diets you give them are going to benefit what's actually eating them. So if you're rearing them at a high level, you can there's no way you can't tell me that with a like a booming white culture, like a just a Fulsomia Canada standard white, the one we send you has thousands of springtails in it. And if you just keep feeding that thing, it will grow into tens of thousands. So there's no way you're not going to be able to feed a dart frog with tens of thousands of springtails that are full of clay and good food, nutrition that the frog needs. So on a smaller level, though, like obviously your beardie's not going to be eating these things. It's not going to give them enough anything. That's why you need those big juicy dairy cows that are banging at a crazy rate too, man.
Yeah, the dragon, just from what I've experienced now, the bearded dragon, they're kind of slow. Like they don't just go hustling hard. Like they almost don't see everything either. Like they've got to get that head turned and that one eye looking at something that's wiggling and going for it. And those springtails, I think it'd just be too small, too fast. And really, he wouldn't be able to like lock in and focus on something. He kind of has to be a little slower, like isopods, worms, things like that. He ate a big old fat worm about 2 days ago. He ain't eaten anything since. Hey, let's get into some. We got a couple questions. You want to start asking some?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's see.
Machiavelli and gaming was the first. Thinking about buying some beneficials from MI. I live in Central Valley of California, and it's 95 plus Fahrenheit. How likely are they to arrive alive?
Cali Machiavelli.
So, it would depend on what you're getting. If you're getting springtails are going to be probably the most sensitive. And if you're getting just springtails, I would definitely urge you to get overnight shipping. If you're getting biodiversity packs, we might be able to get away with 2 day, but if it's like when I look at the weather, and I need to put this more explicitly on my website just so there's no ambiguity, but people usually reach out to me if they have any issues, or I'll like send them an email and say, hey, it's going to be super freaking hot. We got to wait till next week. But 95 plus, I would urge you to think about doing overnight to make sure they make it. Otherwise, we like to guarantee basically everything we ship. We haven't really left anybody high and dry ever, so we would likely just have to wait till next week, and hopefully it comes down. But I'm getting to a point where I'm gonna probably have to. Summers are getting so hot so early now, especially too, that we're there might come a point where we have to start doing overnight shipping required to certain spots where it's going to be 100 plus, because the goal is to get you live things. It's not for anybody to be outed or for anybody to lose money or anything else, and our goal is not to leave anybody high and dry. So that's a tough one, but I do have insulation. I do have ice packs. I have phase packs that protect the beneficials. I have the whole gambit of everything. But when it's 95 plus, Brian can probably back me up on this. 2 day shipping is very, very, very hard to guarantee that things are going to be coming alive in that heat. And I don't think, I mean, Brian, what do you do in 95-degree?
If it's overnight, we can make it happen. We usually ship pretty late in the evening, but to solve the problem for people in Arizona, California, Texas, for my businesses, there's also a hold for pickup option. And that's what a lot of people that live in these states choose to do. So if you ship it overnight, we guarantee live arrival. If you ship it in a 2-day, but it's a hold for pickup, so the only nuisance is you have to go obviously and pick it up at the actual location. But that has eliminated 98, 97% of any problems that we've had. And again, Mark, I know you talk to your customers. We do the same thing. And so when they realize that we're being proactive and we're saying like, hey, it's 103 at your location, a lot of the customers don't even know that. And so those are the kind of things that just kind of staying on top of your business and learning about that hold for pickup, I think has been a game changer.
You can do that with UPS and USPS, Brian.
Uh, for most of the cities, because it matters where these hubs are, right? And it's usually with FedEx, to be honest, and it's FedEx hubs. So the only downside would be you have to be in a pretty big city for that to work. Like if you live in the outskirts or something, that's probably not going to work for you. But there is other ways, like Denver, Miami, New York, stuff like that. Ann Arbor, I would imagine. So like the bigger cities anywhere that you're at would probably have a FedEx hub. Same guy had kind of like a follow-up real quick. Is there a way to keep them alive and reproducing in my beds? And I would imagine he means raised beds.
Yeah, so that helps with wondering what you were talking about. I would recommend Benny Boost, or just look at the ingredients in Benny Boost. Those kinds of ingredients, fungal dominant amendments, I guess is what I would call them, like a seed meal, barley, corn, lentils, stuff like that. But here's the caveat to that is if you've got pests that you're going after, I wouldn't recommend feeding, because your goal is you want to kind of choke out the system, right? You want to limit what the beneficials have to feast on, and that limit would be the pest larvae and stuff like that. So before you start supplementing like Benny Boost, I would recommend like waiting for your issues to drop off, because they're going to be plenty fed.
And to be honest, man, I mean, if you're using the white temperate springtails in your raised beds and you're chopping and dropping every now and then, eventually it's going to look like Christmas morning when you start to water in there, whether you want it to or not. They just love the cannabis plant itself. And I haven't really seen anybody go the extra mile with the designer isopods in the raised bed. So you would be at the forefront of that if you decided to play around with it. Rick Easley, shout out to Rick. Will springtails eat each other if there's a lack of protein? You kind of went over that a little bit earlier.
No, they won't, but you'll notice the population drops. And that's because they have a relatively short lifespan. So that it's kind of like the part of that spatial awareness, I think, where if there's a lack of food, they just start to fall off, where like your young adolescents, the young buck of the tribe will be feasting the most. The old folk will get shorted, and the young kids won't be around as much either. You know what I'm saying? So consider that. And like if you're talking specifically about like the reds and the oranges, definitely not, because the oranges are pretty prolific. Especially the not the Florida oranges are also prolific, but I can't remember they're called a Protonura is the what a lot of places call them. They're also called yucks, yuuk. I can't remember the whole Latin of it, but those ones are super prolific. But again, they'll do the same thing. They'll ebb and flow based on what you're feeding. And that's why I feed every 3 days. I don't do that on accident. I try to time it every 3 days, because I know if I keep these guys cranking and I know that sweet spot, I can rear these at a higher level, to feed a reptile or an amphibian, or sell them commercially.
We got some bonus questions from the audience for Kevin. So
Yep.
just want to throw those to Kevin real quick here.
Cool.
Kevin, what are you using to grind up your wood and acorns?
Yeah, so I'll take you through the whole process of how that went. The first the first thing I was doing was I was getting acorns in a big 20-gallon grow bag, flexible grow bag that I could close the handles up on, and I just started smashing it with a hammer. And I got them broke up enough that it would expose that meat, and it'd become a food source, and it would allow the IMO3s to take off. After that, I got gunny sacks, and I would fill them with the acorns and nuts and pine cones and bark and everything. And I would set it out on the road. I'd just run it back and forth over with my truck, back and forth, crushing it up. And that's a really good way right there. And then finally, what I did last Christmas, I believe it was, everything going on sale on Amazon, man. I just looked at the shredders they had up there, the wood chippers, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was around $500 for that chipper, and it was about an $800 chipper. It's on Instagram back there. If you look back, even in the fall time of just 2003, that's when I was shredding everything. It makes a world of difference. You can still make good IMO3, but it's more of a chunky material. The IMO3 I can make with the shredder, it's like a top dress texture. It's mealy almost. If you needed it mealy, you could get it that way. So a good shredder, if you can, if you have the land where you can keep getting the material and keep grinding and really add to your no-tills and gardens, it's worth it, no doubt about it.
Then I had one more. What do you think of maple seeds for IMO3 plus mulch plus rice mill?
Yeah, you can use it all. You can shred that up, chop them up, smash them up, whatever you want to do. I would kind of like if they've kind of started to dry, a bit, they'll be probably better. If it holds a lot of moisture, it can kind of mess with your IMO3, on the biological level. You can maybe have some things you don't want, and so you want things to be dry, your materials to be drier as you can, and then you add the liquid and moisture to get it to the right texture and wetness that you want. But all of those things are fine. You can use all that stuff. And yeah, you could use maple seed for mulch, right? If you got a ton of them, you could just throw that down, or you could crush them up and use them that way also.
It does seem like there's something special about acorns, just to put that out there. And then I think this is the last one for you again, Mark. Galax the cat. Is it okay to transfer them from charcoal and water?
Yeah, so I've definitely experimented with using charcoal chunks, and that's one of the culturing ways I didn't really discuss. Just because I really didn't have the level of success using charcoal and water. The big problem with charcoal and water is that to harvest them effectively, you got to flood the entire culture to get them up to the top, and then somehow get them off. And if you're using like a aspirator, like I showed you, you're going to be slurping water up. And then somehow you have to reset that culture back down to its normal water level, or transfer the entire culture, which I just found was like horribly detrimental to the populations that I had going. But there's just not, like, the only species that I would even consider trying that on is maybe the whites. I did it. I promise you. You're also eliminating the whole idea of gut loading them with the calcium clay. It's also a secondary food source. So if you're not able to feed them, they can eat that calcium clay. Whereas in a charcoal culture, it's not going to be necessarily the case. So I did not at all care for charcoal and water. I know it's cheaper and more accessible than clay is, because you have to source this stuff usually online. I don't know where to get clay locally. And that's something that I've been working on trying to source now that I'm carrying Springtails and kind of getting into this. I'd love to be able to just say, hey, hop on MI Beneficials for the cheapest price. You know what I mean? That's coming down the road. But charcoal and water is brutal.
Oh, the way it was explained to me too, when they're in the charcoal and water, they can't drown, but at the same time, they're not fornicating. They're like kind of just sitting there. And then what was also explained to me is because they're in water, you're not able to have as many babies and that kind of thing. So everything is slowed down basically. And I guess some people want that, and so that's why they go that manner. But I would say the reptile world and the world that seems like they want the best bang for the buck, calcium is number one now instead of the charcoal.
The other thing too with the calcium is as the so if you start with a decent layer of clay in your culture, it'll last a really long time. But what you'll see start to happen if you have the moisture levels correct when they're starting to munch on the clay is you'll start to see these little divots, tiny little you like it looks like a golf ball almost, but just smaller, and what that is that's exposed surface area, right? Like so now you're expanding your surface area, more crevasses, more cracks, more places for these things to reproduce in. And it does heighten your ability to like as my cultures go on, they're getting better and better and better and better. So and that's using clay. That's using clay, and I never saw that with charcoal.
Excellent. That was the last question, and out of respect to everybody's time, we'll throw it over to you, Mark. Excellent explanations, and to be honest, man, like I said, showing the X's and the Y's and where everybody's going and how the play should actually be run is something rare in this day and age. And I think a lot of people, especially with the white springtails, if you Google that, it's usually seen as a nuisance. Like a lot of the termite type companies and stuff, they pop up for SEO, but it's actually, I think it's counterintuitive, right? They don't want you to learn about the beneficials. So you really have a hard time finding quality information on springtails.
Well, I really hope that for me, I love these springtails because of the way that they look. I just am so fascinated by microorganisms, and to be able to see this process happening in like a colorful display is really fascinating. But what I really hope is that people that are like the dart frog owners, the people getting into bioactives with small insectivores, um, I hope that they start to understand that springtails can be used as a food source in place of wingless fruit flies. Um, Wingless fruit flies, there is not as much nutrition in one of those as there is in a gut-loaded giant red springtail. The problem is that it's easier to go. It's widely available to go buy wingless springtails, and they cost pennies as opposed to $1 to start your culture at home. And the goal is that the reason I share this information is because I want everybody to succeed in rearing these at home, whether it's to, whether it's to start your own springtail business, start a website, do whatever, totally fine with me. Whether it's to feed your reptile at home for cheaper or to enhance your bioactive, I want you to be able to rear these things so that you can actually see the reality of that. Because I think it's kind of gross and ridiculous that you have to rely on like a specially breeded fruit fly. Talk about bringing nasty shit into your house um, to feed your dart frogs. I mean, um, so that I hope that probably maybe not the people watching live, but after this gets posted and shared online and down the road, if people start getting into springtails more and start seeing kind of that light, hopefully this helps people to be able to make that a reality at home. So I appreciate everybody, and you can get these at mibeneficials.com. If you ever have any questions, shoot us a DM. We're happy to help. Um, and it's been a pleasure sharing the knowledge. Brian, what's going on your side?
Yeah, just again, man, excellent conversations with you. I think more people are going to benefit from this because there's about, I don't know, 3 or 4 places you can find decent information on springtails. And then, in my opinion, I think the designer aspects of the springtails will eventually start to be like some of the isopods that I deal with, where there's a little bit of a craze because people didn't even know they existed. And you're definitely ahead of the curve, man. So hats off to you, and appreciate you letting people in with this kind of insight. It's very rare.
Appreciate it, Brian. You got some shows coming up here soon. We just sent out a nice big order to brighten up your
Well, not only am
organism
I, what was
collection.
that one dude used to say, not only am I the president, I'm also a client, right?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I'm talking about this guy, but I'm using his stuff, and it makes my life easier. And to be honest, now that I don't have certain things that always took my money away from me, I'm able to slowly reinvest and start to bring on new things. And the Springtail game is at the forefront of it. And it is a labor of love, and it takes a while, but yeah, man, we have a show this weekend. We plan to really talk about the bioactive side of things. There's a brand new show that started here in Colorado. They just had a show in April. I wasn't able to go to it because my wife was pretty close to giving birth right around then. But they're in September as well, and I had a brief little meeting with them, and they're all about bioactive. And so these people are at the top of their game with snakes and just understanding the culture. And they also see the future in bioactive. And in my opinion, it's pretty hard to say bioactive without a springtail.
I agree, man. We lost Kevin. He's out in the deep woods of Missouri. He just texted and said apologies. He had some technical issues, but I wanted to shout out okcalyx.com, okcalyxshop.com. All of his stuff is amazing. I have mushrooms growing out of my compost now that I never had before after putting his IMO3 in there. And that's
He's
the shit
next
that,
level, man. That's
yeah,
why
that's the
people.
shit that gets me stoked, dude. Being a stay-home dad, wandering around my yard and you know, the slow times of my day and seeing mushrooms popping out of the compost, man, that shit brings a smile to my face, and it's an indication of good soil health. So, appreciate everybody here. Thanks for the questions, guys, and thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.
Absolutely.